Julian Goff. You may not recognize their name, but you've definitely seen their work. If you don't know, Julian Goff is an Irish poet and novelist who's done various books, but is most possibly well known for being the author behind Minecraft's end poem. And his story is one that involves the universe, art, magic mushrooms, the legal system, and a broken friendship. Now let's wind the clock all the way back to 2011. Minecraft was ready to officially launch, but there was one thing missing. You see, this small indie game was already growing a massive following, and Notch felt that it needed an ending. So after working up the End and the Ender Dragon, they had an ending, a final battle between the player and a beast, but there was still something missing. So Notch took to Twitter in search of an ending. Are you a talented writer? Famous is a plus, who wants to write a silly, over-the-top, out-of-nowhere text for when you win Minecraft? And out of the many responses, Notch saw Julian's name. After a few back and forth emails, Julian's end poem was finished, and Notch loved it. It was placed into the game, and Minecraft was sealed and ready to be sold all around the world. Or at least, that's the story that Microsoft would want you to believe. What Julian would say is that from the day Minecraft launched, he was robbed of a story, a poem, and a friend.
The ending text was written by Julian Go, I think his name is pronounced, Gog. I met him a couple of times before because he hangs around like indie game developers in Germany. It's a really weird piece on like, I don't know, metaphysical stuff or whatever. And I really like stuff like that. I couldn't write it as well as he did, but it really fit the mood of just trying to have some kind of bizarre ending that didn't have to reflect what the player did, because I didn't want to undermine what the player did. The game is still about what the player did, but then have a comment on playing a game at all was kind of interesting to have there. And the fact that it's 9 minutes and 45 seconds.
Now there is a lot to this story out in the internet because Julian himself wrote a lot about it in his own personal blog. But here's what you really need to know. Firstly, Julian had total freedom writing the end poem. He asked Notch about any guidelines, and Notch simply said, "Nah man, write whatever you want." So Julian felt comfortable and got to work. Sending it over to Notch, he asked if it was too long, to which Notch responded, "I don't want to change a word." And this is where the artistic side and the business side came crashing down. It was actually Notch who brought up the fact that Julian hadn't been paid. At the time, Julian didn't know, but Notch was already slowly becoming weary of being responsible for the game that everybody knew. He didn't want money for money's sake, but he wanted an out for all of this. But it would be years before anything actually happened. And this is where we're introduced to Carl, who at the time was Mojang's CEO, and what Julian didn't know was that this wasn't a simple paycheck and handshake deal. The conversation is left in the dark, but in the end, Julian was handed a $20,000 check and a false promise of being promoted by Mojang. Before the check was ever seen by him, Carl and Julian were on two different pages, and Carl even threatened to drop Julian and have another ending for Minecraft. But to end his annoyance and preserve the friendship that he had made with Notch, Julian took the deal. But in his blog, Julian does write about what was fair for writing a key element to what he knew was no longer a small indie game. Peanuts and pizza? $1 million? $1,000 success bonus for every million new sales? Shares in the company? But Carl decided it was $20,000 and a contract that Julian never actually signed. But somehow Minecraft still released with his poem in it. I mean, he'd gotten paid, sure, but there was a legal obligation of some sort, right? Well, Julian simply figured out that with them being busy handling the fastest growing game ever, and him simply not wanting to sign or even look at the contract, nothing was to be said. And one thing to note is that the year after Minecraft was out in the public, Notch had $3 million of dividend from shareholders. And instead of keeping it, he chose to split it with the original creators of Minecraft. But this is where Julian felt a bit of remorse for not being included within the small group. Seeing as C418 and Christopher Setterstrand, who made the in-game paintings, both got part of that share. But time went on and Julian never did sign the contract and never got any more money for it. That is until Carl sent him an email. One late evening in August 2014, Carl sent an email with a smiley face in the header asking for the signed contract. Julian had gone through life enough by then that he chose to drop his past with Notch and Mojang and at least look at the contract. And in his very own words, "And I finally got around to reading the original contract. the one I didn't sign. And Jesus Christ, it was worse than I'd ever imagined. It was horrible. Now, Julian clarified that prior to all of this, he had told Carl and Notch, similarly to C418, that his work was not theirs and it wasn't to be sold. But we've seen how that story ended before. The contract in Julian's eyes was cold and horrible. It even included an NDA, or non-disclosure agreement, which would have meant we could never know about this story. But this is where Julian makes it very clear of two things. Firstly, he was hurt, but Carl, Notch, and Mojang were not villains, because there is no villain in this story. If anything, from their perspective, Julian was the one who wasn't agreeing with them. And secondly, Julian learned not from Notch or Carl, but through the internet, that Minecraft was being sold for $2.5 billion. A game that only a few years ago gave him 20 grand and a contract taking away all his rights to a poem he felt so inspired in. What he believes happened is very clear. Notch and Carl needed proof to show Microsoft that they owned everything that was Minecraft, but they didn't, as Julian himself said. And so Carl needed to prove to them that he and Marcus owned everything in Minecraft, so he could sell it to Microsoft. But he couldn't prove he and Marcus owned the ending, because they didn't own the ending. I had never signed away any rights at all. Marcus just had my informal permission to use it on a loan in his indie game for PC and Mac. That was all I ever agreed to back in late 2011 when I wrote a story for a friend. And that was all I'd ever been paid for. Anything beyond that, if it's not Marcus, if it's not indie, if it's not for PC and Mac, we will have to talk again. Now remember, this is not the same Notch from 2011. This is when Notch's depression was starting to go down the deep end. And Julian knew in their eyes he was the bad guy. But suddenly, the $20,000 and hundreds of emails between them were enough for Microsoft. A day before, Julian was blackmailing, threatening, and fighting, and now nothing. And well, Julian himself speaks of what happened to Notch shortly after selling Minecraft. But we all know that part of the story. The one that we don't all know was the fact that Julian knew one thing. He still owned his poem. And it wouldn't be until a few years later on Magic Mushrooms, and no, I'm not joking, Julian was on Magic Mushrooms, that Julian found himself more at peace with the situation, but not entirely. In Julian's Mushroom Indoor trip, he realized something important. Well, this was highly ironic. The universe was rather forcefully trying to get me to take my own advice. The advice that I'd given to millions of strangers back in 2011. It was urging me to finally accept and act on the most difficult line in the end poem. The one I had struggled with the most when writing it. The universe loves you because you are loved. And this is where Julian realized one thing. If he wasn't getting anything from the CEOs and the corporates, why not go to the people? The ones who gave him letters and showed pictures of their tattoos with his words on it. Julian, at the end of the story, finally released the poem. He never signed any contract, never promised he would, and if Mojang said you couldn't use it, Julian said you could. If you are making serious money from it, if you're selling thousands of t-shirts or posters or mugs with my words on them, if you've released a song using all my words as the lyrics and it's doing great, well, I'm not going to chase you for money. I've set the end poem free. But maybe think differently about that money, because it's a gift from the universe. Give some of it away to some person or cause you love. Keep the gift in motion. And that's where the story mostly ends. Right now, Notch is being forgotten in the Minecraft community and being entirely ignored by Microsoft. Nobody really knows where Carl is. And as for Julian, he's writing a new book right now. If C418's story is one about an artist being backstabbed by a company, then Julian's story is one about an artist being backstabbed by a friend. Like Julian said himself, he wrote a story for a friend, and in the end, he got nothing out of it. But Julian eventually realized that was what the universe meant. In Julian's own words, and the game was over. The player woke up from the dream, and the player began a new dream. And the player dreamed again, dreamed better. And the player was the universe, and the player was love. You are the player. Wake up.